Hi, everyone. My name is Jill Sofer. I am a climate philanthropist based near Aspen, Colorado. I've always been passionate about the planet, about nature and snow. I also have a ranch, so I've been watching the climate crisis firsthand. A year or so ago, I'm on the Sierra Club Foundation board. And a year or so ago, I founded Banking for Climate, which is an initiative of high net worth individuals pressuring our banks and individuals, families, and businesses, pressuring our banks to stop funding the expansion of the fossil fuel industry, which is pretty much what today is all about. So today I'm going to share my journey into financial advocacy as a key piece of addressing the climate crisis at any type of speed. Next slide, please. So, like everyone else on this chat, on this call, I started my journey into climate work by addressing my personal carbon footprint, which really doesn't, as important as it is, it doesn't really make enough of a difference because it doesn't address the root cause of the problem. Plus, I'm only one white privileged person, as opposed to many people that we have in our world. So my question became, as the climate crisis got worse and worse, would be what strategy is the most effective and how do we address the root cause of the problem? Next slide, please. So several years ago, I lived in LA. I lived in LA for a long time, and NRDC is a big part of the LA community. And I joined the NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. I joined their leadership, their LA Leadership Council, and we went to DC and we advocated for various environmental issues, and that was great. And we also funded climate-friendly politicians. And then we didn't win enough. And as you can see in the middle there, we've got a picture of our friend Joe Manchin and Susan Collins, who we used to actually, advocate, talk and work with Susan Collins back in the 2010s. And then in 2020, despite all of our efforts, Trump became president, and Mitch McConnell was the head of the Senate. Kevin McCarthy was leading the House. We had a climate denying trifecta. What do we do now? Next slide, please. So back in 2017, which is when Trump's tenure began, he made a big effort to pass the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts. I don't know how many of you recall that tax cut. I'm sure most of you do. Came in December of 2017. It was very quick. And the plan was to fund it and make $2.2 billion to pay for it by selling off the Arctic Refuge. So here we are with no political avenue. What do we do? Gwich'in Native groups who live in the Arctic Refuge, which is that pretty picture on the left there, with help from various NGOs, including a Sierra Club, and also with help from influential bank clients, visited the banks and launched a campaign to pressure financial institutions not to invest in Arctic drilling. They went from bank to bank. And over the course of the next couple of years, the results were that 24 global banks, 5 Canadian banks, and ultimately all 6 US banks pledged to not finance drilling in the Arctic. So when the lease sale happened in January of 2020, only 2 bidders showed up and only 14 million was made. So the moral of the story was, even if you don't have political power, financial advocacy is phenomenally powerful, and it actually works because as of this date, they've yet to drill this part of the Arctic. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, and not surprisingly, the Republican/fossil fuel industry got wind of how powerful and how important this work was, and they have started their own work to push against it. When Trump was president, they passed a rule to make it illegal to quote unquote redline any industry. I love that they're using redline. It's usually has been used traditionally to keep Blacks from buying property. And instead they have now passing in various red states, and many of these laws have already passed, what's called the Energy Discrimination Act. Which they're calling an opportunity to push back against the woke financial institutions that are colluding against American energy producers. It's a very, very powerful lever, and it's financial advocacy works, because if it didn't work, they wouldn't be working so hard to stop us. And it's also very, very important that we keep on activating our power in this world. Next slide, please. So ultimately, I came to the very basic conclusion that I'm sure many of you have come to, which is financial advocacy is so important because we live in a capitalist world, and money matters, and that's kind of how everything happens. As a wealthy donor and funder, and someone who cares immensely about democracy and the climate, we actually have connections. We have assets under management. We have more power than we think we do. And I decided to found Banking for Climate as a way to engage people to activate those aspects that they have not yet used. Next slide, please. And then in sum, we see that climate work is a three-legged stool. Politics is super important. Movement building is super important. I would not stop doing any of that. And financial advocacy has got to be a part of that. Next slide. And at this point, I'm going to set you up to speak to Paul and Ben, who are coming after me. And I'm going to talk specifically about why we're pressuring the US banks to stop funding fossil fuel expansion. So this chart, which was put together by the Rainforest Action Network, it is called their and partners, and it's called their Banking on Climate Chaos report that comes out every year. Will show you that the top funders of fossil fuels in the world are led by the American banks. You've got the four American banks at the very top, with JP Morgan like 33%, further than anybody else. Morgan Stanley's on that list, and other banks, Canadian banks, RBC. But this is why it's important, and many of us have accounts and relationships at these banks or are somehow involved with them because they are American banks. So that's why we're focusing on them. And then the next slide, please. And as a Merrill Lynch client, I am very highly aware, and many of you may be aware of this also with your own relationships with your banks, that while I write a check to a frontline group to fight a problem, often Merrill is funding, or Bank of America is funding the problem. And I learned that when I was very engaged in the fight to stop the tar sands pipeline line 3 up in Minnesota last year, and found out that while I was, we're all worried about it and attending webinars and the like, Bank of America, my bank, participated in a $1.5 billion syndicated credit facility to Enbridge for the pipeline. So my money was helping that. So that's, again, another exclamation point on the issue of why financial advocacy is so important. Next slide. Quickly, I'm going to define what fossil fuel expansion is, because that's what we're talking about. It's new drilling, pipelines, gas plants, import and export terminals. What they do is they expand our dependency on fossil fuels. Please remember that when you build new infrastructure, it takes 30 to 50 years to depreciate. So that they're locked in. We're usually locked in and addicted to them. It stops us from solving the climate crisis, which is going to be the next slide. And all of these are really bad for the banks to hold on their books, because with the growth of clean energy, and as clean energy gets cheaper and more obsequious, it is very likely that these will become stranded assets. They're portfolio risk. And the last piece, which is really important because many of us work on environmental justice, is that these projects are always built in poor communities of color. And below we have what's going on in St. James Parish, Louisiana, which is also called the Cancer Alley. We have Port Arthur, Texas, the more LNG export terminals, that's liquid natural gas, and then the beautiful tar sands of Alberta to Canada. Next slide, please. And lastly, just to clarify why fossil fuel expansion will absolutely keep us from solving the climate crisis, the International Energy Agency came out with a report last year of how to get to net zero by 2050 for 400 different economic sectors, and there's a way to do it. But the one overarching conclusion they came to was that none of this will work if it will only work if there is no new investment in fossil fuel supply starting last year. Thank you. So now I'm going to pass you on to Paul Rissman. He is my co-Sierra Club Foundation member. And he will introduce himself. Oh, wait, Ben, you're next. I apologize. Whoops, I'm sorry. Ben Cushing, who's head of financial advocacy at Sierra Club. He's amazing. I've done a tremendous amount of work, and he will tell you what they've been doing to push this movement forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, and then I'll pass it off to Paul next. Yeah, thank you all for coming today. As Jill said, my name is Ben Cushing. I am based in Washington, D.C. I am the campaign manager for Sierra Club's Fossil Free Finance campaign, which is our work focused on the financial sector in the largest Wall Street institutions. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about taking a step back and talking about our financial advocacy work, and in the context of this shareholder season, and try to take us to what Paul is going to talk about and why we are focused on shareholder advocacy with the largest U.S. banks, and how those banks are connected to the largest asset managers in the world, and what you all can do about it. But I wanted to put a little bit of context on our work up to this point. So this is just a kind of really quick diagram of explaining one of Sierra Club's major strategic priorities for the next several years, which is shifting trillions of dollars away from the fossil fuel dirty extractive economy to a clean, renewable, regenerative economy. And we can think about that in a few different ways, as represented by this chart in terms of public finance and government dollars, private finance. We can think about investing in good, clean, renewable industries, and shifting finance away from dirty, polluting industries. And so we're going to talk most specifically kind of on this left bottom quadrant here around stopping private finance of fossil fuels. But we really see all of these pieces around shifting money as part of kind of a larger whole. So next slide. So this is work that we've been doing for several years now. At this point, at Sierra Club, it really started, as Jill was mentioning, in the early days of the Trump administration, where we began ramping up our work in this area by focusing on the largest financial institutions, and particularly the largest US banks and asset managers. And we've really seen this work take off in some powerful and interesting ways, and some of the impact that this work is having on holding corporations accountable and ensuring that there is diminishing financing out there for some of the most egregious types of new fossil fuel development out there. And so this is really a growing and lively part of the climate movement that I think follows as sort of the 2.0 version of what many folks were familiar with, the fossil fuel divestment movement that kicked off more than a decade ago, really with universities and campuses and churches and foundations, et cetera, focused on divesting their shares from fossil fuel companies. So calling for university endowments and church pensions, et cetera, to drop their stock portfolio from big oil and gas companies like Exxon, for instance. And while that work certainly continues, the area that we're really focused on is challenging the largest financial institutions, which are doing so much to drive new investment into fossil fuel companies and facilitating fossil fuel expansion, which, as Jill mentioned, is really step one to solving this crisis. So next slide. So we're approaching this, using what Sierra Club does best, with focusing both on the outside and the inside game, using our enormous grassroots base as the largest grassroots environmental organization in the country, as well as our policy expertise and connections and brand and influence to directly engage with companies and decision makers and policymakers to change corporate behavior. So, we're both flexing our power from the outside, as well as showing up on the inside at shareholder meetings and engaging directly with banks and financial institutions around these issues. Next slide. So Jill mentioned the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge as a key example of this work, and one of the case studies that we're really proud of to have played a part in. So working, as Jill mentioned, with our Indigenous partners from the Gwich'in Nation in Alaska, we worked to call on all of the major US banks and banks around the world to not finance any drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And we did that again by rallying outside support from the grassroots, and maybe some of you helped participate in some of that, as well as going directly to the banks themselves and meeting with more than a dozen of them alongside our partners to really help them understand the human side of this story, and to meet face to face with some of the leaders and communities that would be impacted by financing for Arctic drilling. And so on the right is a picture of a few of us that went to New York City and met with a number of the banks a couple of years ago. Next slide. So we saw that the outcome of that work was a really successful result, with all of the major US banks committing within a few months of each other to not fund Arctic drilling. And this had followed from some of their own previous commitments on not funding new coal projects as well. And so this, I think, was a really strong validation and inspiration for our work to continue to focus on challenging investments in egregious fossil fuel development, and really pointed the way towards ramping up this work and focusing on trying to stop fossil fuel expansion more broadly. Next slide. So wanted to also quickly make the connection here to major asset managers. So I've been talking a bit about big banks, and one of the other key pillars of our work is focused on the largest asset managers in the world. The biggest of them is Blackrock, which you've maybe heard of. And Blackrock manages about $10 trillion in assets, which is more than many countries' GDP. And it is the largest shareholder or one of the largest shareholders of nearly every public company under the sun. And so that gives it enormous power to shift corporate behavior and have huge ripple effects across the economy. And so for the last several years, we've been engaging with Blackrock, again, both using our outside grassroots pressure as well as direct engagement with the company to shift Blackrock's behavior. Next slide. And here again, we've seen really powerful results. So just a few years ago, Blackrock CEO Larry Fink, who's seen on the left there, was barely talking at all about climate change. He is, has a pretty big media profile. He puts out an annual letter every year where he waxes poetically about a number of topics that he's focused on in the world and what BlackRock's doing about them. And a few years ago, he didn't really even mention the words climate change, didn't have much to say about it. We then launched our campaign with partners, and by the next time he issued his annual letter, it was entirely about climate change and how climate was going to reshape the world of finance and what BlackRock was going to do to be at the center of it. And so this was a pretty major shift. And as I said, BlackRock being the largest shareholder of basically every public company out there, this sent shockwaves across the financial world and the business world that BlackRock was beginning to talk like this. And BlackRock, begun taking some concrete steps towards divesting some of its portfolio away from coal, and has pledged to use its shareholder power more forcefully in driving climate action. And BlackRock, I think has still a long way to go in terms of actually making good on its promises and rhetoric. But this is an enormous shift that we've seen, and has real implications for so many of the companies it invests in, including the banks. And that's kind of where we tie this back together, as BlackRock being one of the largest shareholders of all of the big banks. I should just note here, apologies, I don't have a slide for this, but just today, just a few hours ago, our coalition launched a new parallel campaign targeting Vanguard, which we'll talk a bit more about, and Paul can talk more about it as well. And Vanguard is the world's second largest asset manager. And many of you, I'm sure are familiar, or maybe even are customers and clients of Vanguard. And so we just this morning launched a new campaign targeting Vanguard as well, to continue the momentum and pushing the asset management industry in the right direction. Next slide. So tying these things back together, so we talked a bit about the banks, and Jill mentioned U.S. banks being the largest funders of fossil fuels, and the big asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard being the largest shareholders of the banks. Just to really underscore this point that the largest US banks are really the biggest problem here. The report that Jill mentioned tallies up bank financing of fossil fuels in the years since the Paris Agreement was adopted. And you can see there that the four largest US banks, JP Morgan Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, are the largest by far, with JP Morgan by quite a wide margin. If you add in Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, which are the other largest US banks, those 6 US banks alone make up 31% of total fossil fuel financing in the world out of the 60 largest global banks. So this is really a US problem with a lot of both opportunity, as well as I think an obligation for those of us here in the US to fight this problem head on. Next slide. And then just lastly, as a segue to what Paul's going to talk about, we are really particularly focused on the issue of fossil fuel expansion, and underscoring the fact that if we are going to address the climate crisis, and also prevent the worst impacts on vulnerable, marginalized communities that are often bearing the brunt of new fossil fuel development, new oil and gas fields, new coal mines, new coal plants, LNG terminals, and the like, then we have to, step one, stop new fossil fuel expansion. And then, take on the longer process of unwinding existing fossil fuel investment and infrastructure. But here again, you can see on the right that some of the largest US banks are the top funders of the companies doing the most to expand new fossil fuels. And so again, just even looking at the companies doing the most to expand fossil fuels, US banks are the biggest problem here. And so that is what our shareholder resolutions that the Sierra Club Foundation and others have filed and have been leading on are trying to address most acutely. And so that is my segue over to Paul Rissman, who will take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Jill. Hello, everybody. I'm Paul Rissman. I'm a board member of the Sierra Club Foundation, which is the fiscal sponsor of the Sierra Club. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the foundation is doing to help this project along. But first, I want to tell you about a poll that we have. And we have instructions for the poll. And Dallas, would you mind coming on and telling everybody how to access the poll?
Sure. After your section, if everybody could just let us getting involved, we would appreciate it. It'll pop up in the lower part of your screen and you can choose one of three options or all three if you'd like.
Okay, so watch out for the pop-up in the lower part of your screen for the poll, please. Why don't we go to the next slide? So I will dwell on this for a while. Ben told you about how the inside game and the outside game, where we united banks, pressure on banks from investors with pressure on banks from grassroots activists, how that worked pretty well when we were trying to get banks to stop financing drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And we're trying to do that again with fossil fuel expansion. I'm a bank customer. I'm a customer of Bank of America. And I could go yank my money out of Bank of America. That'd be fine, except, you know, they've got all their hooks in me. Like all of my digital payments go through my bank account. And so if I took my money out of Bank of America, I'd have to change all the digital payments. I can't even remember what they all are. So I basically have to wait until I got overdrawn to figure out where all my digital payments are. And they do that with everybody. That's their strategy. You know, that's how they keep you as a customer. So, you know, for my piddling little amount that I have in Bank of America, it's really not worth it for me to put into the effort to take my money out and move it somewhere, because I don't even know if I'm going to move it anywhere good or not. So on the other hand, I am a Vanguard customer too. And as Ben has mentioned, money managers have an exorbitant amount of influence over the banks. In this case, Vanguard happens to be the largest shareholder of all 6 of these banks. They own about 8.5% to 8% of every single bank. Actually, Berkshire Hathaway owns more of Bank of America than Vanguard does. But so the money management industry is so concentrated that Vanguard, Blackrock, State Street, and then like Fidelity, for example, T. Rowe Price, you put those money managers together, they own about 20% of every single bank. And even one money manager, I mean, Vanguard, if your largest shareholder who owns 12% of your shares tells you to do something, you're going to do it. So instead of getting all these customers to try and influence the banks, which might even be to their detriment, why don't we get all these customers of funds to get the funds to influence the banks? And that might be much more efficient. And in fact, the funds, while the banks really don't have an incentive, a financial incentive to do this, the funds do have a financial incentive to do this. And it's because they're going to be experiencing a lot of risk from banks financing fossil fuel expansion. So if you can get the funds on your side, then you can get them to influence banks on your behalf. So this is the point of what we're doing now. So in order to get the funds on our side, Sierra Club Foundation filed a bunch of shareholder resolutions because shareholders get to vote, and only shareholders get to vote. Not only do they get to vote on shareholder resolutions, they get to vote for directors. And so directors hate it when they get voted against, because in the old days, directors got like 99% approval every single year. That's not happening so much anymore. And directors are getting a little bit nervous. So only shareholders can vote for shareholder resolutions. Only shareholders can vote for directors. And that sort of puts the fear of the Lord into companies. Because again, these people own enormous amounts of stock. And so we filed shareholder resolutions, hoping that the large money managers will support them. And the shareholder resolutions ask the banks to come up with policies that would prevent them from running afoul of the 1.5 degree pathway that the International Energy Agency has specified will keep us at or below 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, which is the threshold for preventing catastrophic climate change, like much more catastrophic than what we're experiencing these years. And the reason why the money managers might be interested in that is because of this slide. So if we're going to get to 1.5 degrees centigrade, demand for oil and gas has to fall 3 to 4% per year. That happens to match, coincidentally, the natural rate of decline of existing oil and gas fields and existing oil and gas reserves. So we don't need to drill more. We can get to a 1.5 degree pathway. We can satisfy all the demand that we need to get to a 1.5 degree pathway with existing reserves. We don't need to drill anymore. If you drill more, then those reserves will not be needed in a 1.5 degree world. Don't forget, the 1.5 degree world comes from the Paris Agreement, which is a binding treaty, which has been approved by every country in the world now, luckily the United States, except for, I think, Syria. So if governments force a 1.5 degree world, which is according to their binding treaty commitments, they need to, then any new oil and gas projects will be unneeded. And when they're unneeded, you invested all this money to start exploring and drilling, and you're not going to make any money from them. That becomes a stranded asset. And that means that the oil companies are losing money on these assets. And when the oil companies are losing money on the assets, they've borrowed money from the banks. They have a harder time paying back that money. And so it becomes a financial risk for the banks. And that's what we want the asset managers to know about, is that financing fossil fuel expansion becomes a financial risk for the banks. These money managers own the bank stocks, and therefore it's in the money managers' interests, because when the bank stocks go down, then the money managers' portfolios go down too. It's in the money managers' interest to keep their portfolios from going down in this way by making sure that the banks do not finance stranded assets. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this, if you remember 2008, the financial crisis, which almost took down the entire banking system. Stranded mortgage assets, because that's what was the problem, were about $4 trillion. Stranded oil and gas assets are projected to be, under this scenario, between $7 and $11 trillion. So almost double to triple the amount of stranded assets for the oil and gas companies as we saw for the mortgage companies. Next slide, please. And so that's why Sierra Club Foundation has filed these 6 shareholder resolutions, has filed resolutions with the 6 largest banks. JP Morgan actually has 2 resolutions. And here's the language of the resolution on the left, which is what I explained earlier. We want a policy committing to proactive measures to ensure that the company's lending and underwriting don't contribute to new fossil fuel development. Now, the other interesting thing is there's this organization called the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and all these banks are members of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. So they've all committed to a 1.5 degree pathway already. And so if they've committed to a 1.5 degree pathway, but they're not actually serious about being on a 1.5 degree pathway, which is what would be shown if they continue to finance fossil fuel expansion, then they're greenwashing. And all sorts of stuff has come out about greenwashing. Bank regulators especially do not like greenwashing. And so that's another big risk for the investors, is if the bank regulators come down on these banks, make them pay penalties for greenwashing, again, that makes the bank stocks go down. Investors don't like it when their bank stocks go down. So investors actually have a variety of incentives to keep banks from financing fossil fuel expansion. Next slide, please. There's one big problem with this, and that is the world's largest money managers are crappy financial stewards when it comes to climate change. So if you look at asset managers' voting records on environmental proposals and social proposals last year, all 4 of the largest money managers in the world were ranked in the bottom quartile in terms of responsibility. And they have commitments too, however. They are all members of something called the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. So there are all these initiatives. There's a Net Zero Insurance Initiative, there's a Net Zero Asset Owners Initiative, there's a Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, there's a Net Zero Banking Alliance. They all begin with the letters NZ, which stand for net zero. And all these money managers have also committed to aligning their portfolios with a 1.5 degree world. And they've also all committed to using proxy voting as an escalation tool. In other words, voting for shareholder resolutions. They've committed to this. They are not living up to their commitments. A really good report came out just this morning from an organization allied with Sierra Club called Reclaim Finance. If you could put the link in the chat, please, Dallas, to that report. It goes over the 30 largest money managers in the world and tells you exactly how bad they are, and they're bad. And they shouldn't be bad because they have these commitments. So as their customers, you can hold them to these commitments. And what will you do? You will embarrass them. They like when they make commitments and somebody calls them out on it, that is very embarrassing to them because all these money managers hold up their integrity as their most important asset. So if you can smack them on their integrity, that will sting them. And so in order to do that, we have produced a series of letters. And so can we go to the next slide? So if you are a customer of Blackrock, Vanguard, State Street, or Fidelity, which are the top 4 money managers in the world, we have letters for you to download that ask these managers to live up to their Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative commitments and support the bank resolutions. And so if you can download them, if you are a customer, all you have to do is download them. The link is in the chat in case you can't access the link through this slide. And all you have to do is fill in your name. This is for institutions, but individuals can do it too. Fill in the fund that you're invested in if you know it. If you want to customize the letter you feel free. And then you just email the letter to the address that we have on the top for you. And if you could do that, let us know that you did it, and then let us know if anybody ever responds to you, because they kind of have to respond to you if you're their customer, because of another reason. They are what is known as your fiduciary. A fiduciary duty is the highest duty known to the law, according to famous jurists. What it means is they have a duty of care and a duty of loyalty to you, means that they have to be very attentive to your preferences as their customer. And they also have to provide you with a duty of care, which means they have to protect you from risk. So this is a risk. And your portfolio is going to suffer if your money manager owns these banks and the bank stocks go down because they lent to oil and gas companies, which ended up producing stranded assets. It's a chain of logic, but it's worth it. And so that's what we are asking you to do. And that concludes the formal presentation.